Hey, are you ready for the Google Sheets service section? Well, this section we're going to be covering the Google Sheets Spreadsheet app service. And this is the service that allows you to create, access, modify the Google Sheets, and also access and create Google Sheets and files within your Google Drive. So we're going to be looking at how macros work, generating Google Apps script from macro recordings, the Google Sheet app class, selecting spreadsheets to manipulate the code, also working with bound scripts within the Spreadsheet app, selecting the sheets, updating content within the sheet, getting content from the sheet, and manipulating all of the spreadsheet data using code, selecting sheets within the spreadsheet, how you can get values, how you can select the range to interact with using Google Apps Script, then also standalone scripts, how we can connect to a spreadsheet app, updating the sheet names, setting sheet names, creating brand new sheets, generating content within the sheets, updating some of the properties such as the background as well as the font sizes that are contained within the cells of the sheet, how to use the rows and columns to calculate out ranges and select content that's contained within your spreadsheet. There's also debugging within the code editor, so the Google Apps Script code editor, and a little bit more about the dashboard, how it works, and how you can interact with the Google spreadsheet and write some app script code to produce some functionality. And we've also included several mini apps, and one of them is going to be showing you, demonstrating how you can select content from the sheet and interact with it, and adding to the UI menu within the sheets. So customizing a menu that runs functions within the back end of the Google script. And these scripts then can run and produce some advanced functionality. So also modals, how you can add and interact with the sidebar menu, appending rows, inserting rows, cell formulas, and a whole lot more. Also how we can create a Google Apps Script logging system that logs and tracks content directly within the spreadsheet. So this is going to be one of the mini projects, and all of the code is also included. So you can use these code snippets within your own scripts to produce and add the functionality. There's also another coding project here within this section where we're going to be introducing how we can prepend content at the top of the sheet. So all this and a whole lot more, let's get started with Google Sheets. Hey, welcome. In this lesson, we are going to be creating a bound script, and that's going to be a script that's bound to a Google Sheet. So let's go ahead and create our Google Sheet that we can work out of. So going into Drive, or you can go into your Google Apps and create a sheet from there. So there's a number of places to create a sheet. I'm going to go into my Drive, select the folder that I want the sheet to appear in, click New, and from the drop-down menu, go ahead and create a brand new spreadsheet. This is going to be just a regular blank spreadsheet. Let's give the spreadsheet a name. And I'll just call it Learn Spreadsheets. And within the spreadsheet, there's a few options, and spreadsheets have the ability to create macros. So what essentially a macro is this is going to be a block of code that you can run from the tool menu. So going under the Tools tab, select Macro, and then record the macro. So let's go ahead and record the macro. So right now it's recording the macro, and I'm going to select some content. I'm going to bold it, make it bigger, and let's give it a background color of red. And once we've completed it, let's go ahead and save the macro. And we'll just call it test 1. And with macros, you can also add in shortcuts in order to run the macros. So once you save the macro, so it's saving the macro, and you get this pop-up here that says Edit Script. And then also under Tools, Macros, you have an option to record another macro. You have an option to run the macro. So let's delete out what we changed here. We'll reset it back to normal. And also the background color, so we'll just reset that. So just reset everything back to normal. And now let's take the macro and we're going to run the macro. So what this does is it asks you for the authorization, and that means that This is an authorization to update to the spreadsheet content. So go ahead and click continue, select the account that you want to provide the permissions to. And this is the same thing that we do with the Google Apps script, where we need to provide permissions for the script to run. And it gives us a warning message. If we ever do want to look at which scripts we've given permissions to, we can always open up within the Google account, myaccount.google.com/permissions. And from there, where I'm hovering right now, it says Google account, you can get a listing of all of the scripts that you've enabled to run and provided access within your Google account. So I'm going to go ahead and allow this to run. And let's write some code. And we'll do a test macro. So what it did is it ran the macro and wrote out what I wrote out, the text that I wrote out, updated the formatting of the cells, and recreated it. So that is essentially what we captured within the macro. And now under the macros menu, you also have manage macros. So this will give you an option for the different macros that you have available that you've created. And within the macro, you have an option within the three little icons there, the three little dots. You can edit the script or you can remove the macro. So go ahead and select edit script on the macro. And what this is going to do is this is going to open up that same script editor that we saw earlier. And what the macro is, it's actually created the script in order to run and do what we set out to do. So here we've got where we're selecting using the SpreadsheetApp class, so we're getting whatever the active spreadsheet is. And then using the spreadsheet object, where we've defined the spreadsheet object, we're getting a range, and that range is going to be B4. And we're activating B4. So that means that the next set of instructions are going to be updating the content within this active cell. So we're getting the current cell, we're setting a value to it, and then we're activating another cell, and we're setting a value to it. And that's all of the details about what the functions are doing and the methods are doing. And then next up, we're selecting range and setting that as the active range. And then that active range, we're setting the font weight to bold. We're setting the font size to 14, setting the background color to, I believe this was red. And then we're activating F8, but we're not doing anything within F8. So what I want you to do now is to update the macro code and get it to set a value of hello and then world in two cells beside each other. You can update the cell values. And then also change the font size to be 18. And then also update the background color to be blue. And then also within F8 or within another cell, just write done. So you can pause the video here, create your macro, and update the code, and then I'll walk you through the solution. So what we saw with the macro, I'm going to do a quick update and select a different cell. So I'm going to select A1 activate, and for A1, write hello. And for A2, I'm going to write world. So I'm just updating the contents of the macro. And then the range that I want to activate is A1 to A2. So setting that as active. And we want it to update the font size to 20. We want to set the background color to be blue. And then we want to activate another cell and just write done within the cell. So let's copy some of the code that we had there earlier. And we'll just write the word done. And then we might want to update which cell we're setting as active. I'm going to select A4 as the active cell. So let's save it and then run the code. And then once the execution has completed, let's go back to the spreadsheet and see what happened. So we ran the macro and we populated the cells with hello world. We turned the background green, and on cell 4 we wrote done, so on A4. So if we want to update this, the way that the cells work, so column by row. So now let's update it to say hello world right next to each other, and then the done will be on column D instead of on a row 4. So let's make a quick update to that. So column A, column B, and then we're selecting A to B1 and setting the font size, and I believe I need to make this blue, so I think it's FF is the last two, so it's 0000 FF to be blue, setting it as active, and this is going to be D1, so D with a row 1, and set that to done. Let's clear out the content of the spreadsheet. So just set it at default. We'll reset the colors, reset the font size, and just delete the content. And now let's run the macro and take another look at it. So we set it to blue, A and B, and then wrote done, and world still popped up in B2. So let's go take a look and see what happened there. And I did put it as B2, so it should have actually been B1. So let's run and update the updated value, and we've got hello world and we've got done in the last cell. So go ahead, try it, create your own macro, and coming up next I'll show you some more really cool things, and we're going to dive right into the app script and start writing some code. So it's coming up next. Hey, I've zoomed in on the screen. We still have the macro from the previous lesson, so that's still sitting within our Google script. And this lesson, we're going to be writing just straight Google Apps script. So you also have the option with the macros, as we saw in the previous lesson, to generate script with the macro, and then you can update that script to run and do what you want within the updated script. And sometimes that can save you some time on the script itself. And of course, it's sitting within the same editor. So if we were now to create a brand new function and select the spreadsheet and then use the contents of that spreadsheet app, we can update it with the script as well, so directly with the script. So we're going to be using a class called SpreadsheetApp, and this allows you to access and create Google Sheets files. And this is the parent class for the spreadsheet service. So we see it being used here within the macro as well, where it's just getting whatever the active document, and there's always a pop-up here within the editor that tells you what exactly the get active does. Is it returns the currently active spreadsheet, or null if there is none. Functions that are run in the context of the spreadsheet can get a reference to the corresponding spreadsheet object by calling this function. So basically what's happening here is we're assigning the active spreadsheet as an object to the variable spreadsheet. So let's mimic some of that and create a brand new function, and we can call this function test2. And within the function, so the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to select the spreadsheet, and I'm going to just do a short form of SS for the spreadsheet, and selecting the spreadsheet app, so that's the main parent class. And when you do the dot, you've got all of the methods that are available. So you can get the active sheet, so that means that whatever the active spreadsheet is that the user is currently on, or you can just get the active spreadsheet, and the sheet and the spreadsheet. So the spreadsheet is the entire spreadsheet application app, and the sheet is going to be the current sheet that the user is on. So let's select the get active spreadsheet value. And by definition, the get active and get active spreadsheet, they're both going to do the same thing, where they're going to return the null if there's no active spreadsheet, or it will return the active spreadsheet object in SS, and that allows us to use it and to manipulate some of the content that's contained within there. So let's output to the spreadsheet. We're going to output the URL within the logger. So logger is what you can use as you're debugging, you're writing your code. So within the logger itself, now that we've got the spreadsheet object, we can get some information. So get the active spreadsheet, we can get the URL of the spreadsheet, so we can get it as a blob, and there are really just so many different options. So the one that we want to do is get the URL of the active spreadsheet. So that's way down here at the bottom. And because this is a method, so we got to use the rounded brackets. What logger log? So it tells us what is going to happen here, that the logger is going to log the log, and it requires some data within the parentheses. And basically it's a message to the log. Now you're going to see the log output within the execution log. So this is now within the newer version where you don't have to go back to find the log. It's just going to be sitting within the execution log. So let's go ahead and run test2. So you can also set a breakpoint if you want as well, if you want to run it as a debug. So before we output the log, we can set it within the debug. So there's a number of options when you are debugging. Make sure that you select the right function. We do have 2 of them now, so let's do test2 and hit run on test2. And the execution log shows up like normal, and because we're doing a logger a log, so we're outputting some of the log content into the log for debugging, that's going to be our address of where the spreadsheet is located. So let's go and double check, and that is indeed that same web URL of where the log is located. So let's output a few more items about the log. So we've got the logger log, and there was quite a lot of options. So we have the get URL, you can get the sheets, so that will give you all of the sheets that are currently within there. So if we want to do the get sheets, let's see what gets output into the log for the sheets. So the sheets is going to be an object that gets returned back. So this is going to be a sheet object, and we'll look at this in a little bit more detail. So it's not a straight string that gets returned back. So let's see what else we can return back. So we can get the sheet ID, we can get the sheet by name, and that's referring to the sheets itself. You can get the name, you can get the ID. So let's get the ID, and then we'll also do one more where we'll get the name. And this is all just being logged out into the logs. So remove that one and do the get name. And we'll see what gets returned back here. So again, going into the logs, let's execute test2 function. Just make sure you've selected x2. And we get all of this information. So first we get the URL, then we get the ID. This ID corresponds to the ID that's being used by the spreadsheet, so it's the same as then the URL. And then there's also the name of the spreadsheet. So learn spreadsheets, and we've got that information being output there. So you can select and you can access content within the sheet itself and get some basic information. And there's quite a few options here, so you can utilize this in a number of ways within your script as needed. So go ahead and create your function that's going to select the active spreadsheet, and just to show you that get active is actually going to do the exact same thing. So really there's 2 ways to get whatever the active spreadsheet is. So there's get active and there's get active spreadsheet. So usually I do prefer to use the get active spreadsheet just because when I'm looking at the code, I know I'm selecting from a spreadsheet and so on. So that's my preferred method, but of course there is an option to use get active as well. So right now they're doing the same thing, and at maybe a future point they might be getting rid of the get active spreadsheet, but right now they're both doing the exact same function. So go ahead and create, select your active spreadsheet, and then get some of the values that your spreadsheet contains. And you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson. Hey, in this lesson, we are going to be selecting the sheets. So we've got a number of sheets within the default spreadsheet that we've been working on, just sheet 1, 2, and 3. And we can have different content on the sheets. So I'm just going to populate some content here and also some more content on this sheet. And then we'll use AppScript in order to connect to the sheet content and make some updates to the content contained within the sheets. So I'm just populating some random content into the sheets so that we can make some selections and update the content. So going into the script that we have, and I'm going to also rename it. So I don't have the recorded macros. I can have the learn spreadsheets and do a quick rename on the sheets. In addition, I'm also going to stop using the macros.js file and open up and create a brand new script file. So this is going to be our main script file. So it will automatically give it a name of main.js. And this is creating the default my function. So what we want to do is we want to select the actual spreadsheet that we're on. So we do have a number of sheets. So we want to get the active sheet and select that, and we want to get the sheet name. So let's create a function, and I'll call it test sheet, and actually I'm going to call it test sheet 1, as we'll create a bunch of these functions that are going to be running the tests within the sheet. I'm also going to shrink this down a little bit so that we've got some more space for the code, and we've got the code set, the browser window set to 200. So what we want to do is we want to select one of the sheets, and we need to get the actual spreadsheet app class, And the Spreadsheet app class is going to be the level of spreadsheet that allows us to access and create the Google Sheet files. It's the parent class for the Spreadsheet app service. And we were looking at that within the last lesson, where we can get the active sheet and then we can manipulate and we can select the sheet content contained within there. So let's start by selecting the main sheet object. And I'm going to just give it a value, a variable name of sheet or of SS, and selecting the Spreadsheet app. So this is the main parent class. And we want to get whatever the active sheet is, or the active spreadsheet. So we'll select the active spreadsheet. And then in order to get the sheet itself, we can have the spreadsheet object. So that's going to be the entire spreadsheet, including the sheets itself, is now contained within the SS object. So we can get the active sheet, so whatever the active sheet is. And then within the logger log, we're going to select the sheet object, and we've got a number of options here within the sheet object. So just getting the drop down there, we can get the name of the sheet. So again, it is a method. So we need to have the rounded brackets in order to invoke the method. So what this is going to do is going to write a string to the logging console. So that's what the logger log does. And the get name of the sheet is going to return back the name of the sheet. So let's save that and do a run on the test sheet, and we'll see what gets executed into the execution logs. So currently the active sheet is sheet number 3. So that's the name of the sheet. Let's move the active sheet, and now we're going to have active sheet number 2. And once we've selected within the sheet object, we can get content that's contained on the sheet itself. So let's select that as well. And this is going to be the data that's contained within the sheet object. So we can get the we can get the data range. And what the data range is going to return back all of the active content within the sheet. And if we want to get the values of the data, we can return back the data object from the data range. And using a method called getValues, this is going to return back all of the values. And within the logger log, we'll output values into the log. So let's see what happens now. So depending on whatever the active sheet is, then this is going to allow us to select the values from the sheet. So now we've got this, all of the listed values, and they're just being logged out here within the info. And just as with any other JavaScript object, you can do a for each loop of the content contained within there. So if we want to get the value out separately, we can select the value and then return back the function. And using the logger log, output the content that's contained within the value. So let's do another run of the function. And so this way we're able to loop through each one of the rows of content. Let's select sheet number 3, so we've got some slightly different content there, and run on the debugger. And you can see as we loop through the rows, we are returned back an array, and the array is going to be comma separated out by the contents of the column. So if we want to return back the contents of column number 3, and this is array based and arrays are 0 based, so we can return back those values by specifying the index value that we want to see within the log. So let's try running the log. So what do you think is going to get returned back here, where we're selecting the contents from column number 3, so 0, 1, 2, and that's why we're using 2. So do you think we're going to get back all of these values into the log? Let's try it out and see what happens. So we are returning back all of the contents that are contained within that column within the log itself. Let's try making some updates here, and I'm going to just increment it numerically. And again, just getting some dummy content. If I want to get the second column, I use the index value of 1, and let's run and check the execution log. So now we're getting all of the contents that are contained within column number 1 or column number 2 using the index value of 1, and we're returning into the console. And these are just regular string values, so we can make updates to them, we can make changes to them as needed. And then this is that whole values multi-dimensional array, so arrays nested within the main array, returning back the entire sheet contents. And then here we've got the sheet name, and we've got the execution completed. So that's all within the execution logs. So before the next lesson, go ahead and create your spreadsheet and select some of the values that are contained within the spreadsheet and try it out. And I'll also update and get the values of, and try it out on the different spreadsheets to make sure that you're able to select the content that's contained within those sheets. And you could be ready to move on to the next lesson. So far, we've been working with the active spreadsheet, and we've been working with whatever the active sheet is. So that means that the spreadsheet needs to be open, and we need to have a selected active area. And also, this is only going to work with the bound scripts. Since the standalone scripts aren't going to have an active spreadsheet or an active sheet, you can't use these functions in order to make the selection. So there's a number of other options and methods that can be used, and these can be used within the standalone scripts as well as the bound scripts. So let's start by creating a brand new apps script, so doing a standalone script. And what we're going to do here is we're going to connect to the spreadsheet. So this is just going to independent and selection of the sheets. I'm going to give it a name of sheets2. So this is our function that's going to connect to the sheets. And we'll create some function names here, test1. And then we're going to also have to accept permissions as well to the different authentications that we're going to require when we're running the script. So what we want to do is we want to connect to the Google Sheet, and we want to log out the contents of a selected sheet. So we're going to log out the contents of sheet 1, and using standalone script in order to do that. So the process is always the same, that you're selecting the main object that you want to use. So using the SpreadsheetApp class, we're going to actually be using open by ID. So you do have a couple options here where you can open by ID or open by URL. So opening by URL just requires the full URL being posted there. Typically, what I'll do is I'll open it by ID. So with the ID, it's a lot simpler where you just select the ID of the sheet that you want it to use, and this can be found within the sheet URL where you can select the ID. And I'll create a separate variable for ID itself. So we've got the ID there, and then we're opening it by the ID value and setting that within the spreadsheet app. So now within the variable SS, we've selected the spreadsheet that we want to select. And remember, this is a standalone script. So if we ever want to connect to another spreadsheet, we just need to update the ID. And from now, we can get the sheet as well. So that's the next step, is to select the sheet that we want to use. So let's, using the SS object, we can get all of the sheets, and let's log out all of the sheets. So actually this should be sheets, and then I'll update the variable name. So this is going to return back an array of all of the sheets, and this is just one of the options that we have. So let's run test1, and we're going to have to accept the permissions. This is a brand new script, so we haven't accepted permissions, and every time you create a new script, and if you've updated the permissions that you're asking for, then it's going to ask you to review your permissions and accept the permissions. So you can just go through the accepting of the permissions. The advanced button is down here, and of course the app isn't verified because this is a brand new app that we're just creating right now. And again, if you do need to remove it, then you can always go to your Google account. So it's the myaccount.google.com/permissions, and that's where you're going to get a listing of all of the apps that you've provided permissions to, and it's going to be by the app name. So in this case, it's Sheets2, and it also lists out what permissions that we're providing for the script to run. So I'm going to go ahead and allow that. And what this is doing is this is allowing us to run through, and what's being returned back from the get sheets is an array where we've got all of the sheets are listed. So if I was to create another sheet, and if I run that code again, I get 4 sheets now. So it lists through, and these are being returned back as a sheet object. So if I wanted to return back and get the name of the sheets, we can use the for each to loop through and get each individual sheet if we want. So I'm returning that back within the function and using the arrow format for the function. And then within the logger log, we're going to select the sheet object and then get the name of the sheet and then return that into the log. So once we have it within the sheet object, it's the same thing where we had here, where we were getting each individual sheet, and then we can get the data range of the sheet and we can make the same updates as we saw in the last lesson. So let's clear the execution and see what happens. So now we should return back each one of the sheet names into the log, and they're still within the object format. And you can tell what options you have by the drop down. So once I've got the sheet object, I can select the sheet and pressing the dot. So we can get the name, we can get the sheet ID as well, so they all have sheet IDs. Get the sheet name, and it actually added an extra bracket there. So let's save it and now run it. So it returns back the same sheet name. So just like what we saw where we're getting the active and getting active sheet. So the functions are the same. So we can use either get name or get sheet name. So you can select whichever method that you want to use that makes more sense for you. There's also the option to set the name. And if we select the sheet object, and let's add in the index, and then within the sheet name, within the parentheses, it's expecting the sheet name. And the pop-up will give you an example of how to set the sheet name. So within the string value, it's expecting a sheet name as a string value. So let's call it updated, and then we can concatenate the index value. So what do you think this function is going to do? As we loop through each one of the sheets, we're returning them back as an object called sheet. And then within the code block that we're iterating through, we're also getting the index value, and then we're setting the sheet name. So let's run it and see what happens. So we see that we actually get the updated sheet names, and then it's returning back updated values for the sheet names. So it's as easy as that to select the sheets and make updates to the sheets. So as mentioned, there are a number of other ways to make the selection. So let's create another function. And we're going to select the sheet in another format. So doing it again, open by ID. And actually to do something different, let's do the URL. So it's selecting that entire web app URL. And we'll open it by, instead of open by ID, open by URL. And then within the parameters, we'll set the URL. So do a quick run of test number 2, just to make sure everything is working. So it looks like we were able to get the sheet object, and now let's select the sheets, and we'll get all of the sheet values, and then also show you how you can select the sheets individually. And then as we loop through them, we're getting the sheet object, and I'll just type in new there. Do a test on sheet number 2. And we've got the updated values for the sheet name. And because this is of an array, so let's say we want it to select the first sheet and only update the first one, we can use the index format there and then update the sheet this way. So give it a name of first, and we don't have a value for index. So what do you think is going to happen here with this set of code? When we run it, we'll see what happens. And we updated the first one. with a name of first, and we can update the second one with a name of second. So just as we go through the sheets, we can get the sheet values. Now there's also other ways to select the sheet. So we'll select the sheet and the sheet objects using SS. And the one that I'm looking at is actually going to be get sheet by name. So this is where we're selecting the sheet by the name. So it's expecting a parameter, and that's going to be the name of the sheet. So let's check what we've got. So we do have one called new2. So let's make that selection of new2. So that's getting the sheet value, and we're going to be updating this to updated 100. So what do you think is going to happen here where we're selecting the sheet? We're using a specific selection by sheet by name, and that's how we're going to be able to find the sheet that we want to use. So instead of using the active sheet, we're specific to opening up the sheet by its name. So we're not using the index value, but we're using the sheet name, but then we're setting the name of the sheet. And also let's do a log of the sheet object. So let's do a quick run of that. And if you said that it's going to update the name to updated 100, you're correct. Now, what happens when I run it a second time? Because remember, we are looking for a sheet by a specific name. So we're looking for a sheet that has a name of new2. So that's going to be the parameter that we're expecting. So that's contained within the sheet object. So we're updating it, and I'm going to update it to be 500. So what do you think is going to happen here, and what are we going to see within the execution logs? Because now there is no sheet by the name that we're looking for. So it returns a sheet with a given name. If multiple sheets have the same name, the leftmost one is returned, returns null if there is no sheet with the given name. So what are we going to see within the log? Let's do a quick run. And we can't set name of null, so it's not returning back the null object. So it's going to throw an error. And that's because it hasn't found the sheet by the name. So now if I run it again, we're just going to get a value of null for the sheet. And if I try to get the index, so if I want to get the index value of the sheet, let's do a test run of it. So what do you think is going to happen here? Are we going to see an error, or it's going to just return back null? And if you said it's going to throw an error, you're going to be correct, because again, we don't have the sheet object, so that's why we're throwing errors. So let's add in a condition, and we'll check to sheet, and we'll make sure that sheet is not equal to null. And if it's not equal to null, then we can log out the index. Otherwise, we're just going to log out the sheet object. And we'll also update the name. We'll check for get sheet with a value of new3 as the name of the sheet. So run through it. It returns back the index value of 4. So that's going to be the index value of 4 for the sheet. So that's the fourth one that is contained. And that's how we can access the sheet and also check to see if it's there or not, if it exists or not. And this is one way that you can select the sheets. The other one is just getting all of the sheets and just selecting the index value. The downside of the selecting by the index value is that if we change the order and the position of the sheet, and then if we run and if we output the array, the index value is also going to change. So that means that this sheet list is also going to change. So if I update this to sheet 1, you're going to see that this is all being updated as well. So that's one of the downsides of selecting the sheet. And you do want to try to be as specific as possible in order to avoid any mistakes. So try to specify the sheet by name that you're trying to request. And also, I usually do prefer using the ID in order to make the selection. So go ahead, create a standalone script and select the sheet objects, set the names of the sheet objects, and then also try out just different ways of making the selection. And this code will also run within the bound script as well. So let's go ahead and we're going to create a brand new sheet. So brand new spreadsheet, and give this one a name test2. So we don't have any code in here yet, and we'll set the permissions as we run the script. So then we're going to simply just copy the exact same script that we have within the standalone script, and this is going to be sitting within the bound script for this spreadsheet. Let's make a selection, and we're going to be selecting off of a different spreadsheet. So we've got test 1 and test 2. Let's save those. I've just copied the code directly, and let's run test 2. Or we're actually going to run test 1, and I'll just give it a value of new 5. So it's something different. Selecting test 1, run. It's going to ask us for permissions to access the spreadsheet. We accept the permissions. And this is how you can actually run a connection into one spreadsheet to another. So we've got the spreadsheet values there, and then this one still remains the same. And how about we select the ID from this one, and then we update the ID value for test 1. And it's as easy as that to switch over and get the code to run on another spreadsheet. But oftentimes it makes more sense if you are going to be connecting to multiple different spreadsheets, just have a standalone script. It's going to be a lot easier, unless you do need to have some type of connection between the two spreadsheets. So that one updated the sheet name as well. Hey, in this lesson, we're going to be selecting a spreadsheet and then adding a brand new sheet within the spreadsheet. So we did create a new sheet object, just called it test. And we're going to be selecting and creating a brand new sheet just beside this one. So let's make a selection of the ID, and we need to access the sheet object. I'll just call it make new one. That will be the function that we're going to run. So first, let's using the Spreadsheet app. We're going to open by ID and then specifying the ID. So I'm going to create a variable that's going to hold the ID value. So setting that up and creating the ID as a string value. So this is going to select the sheet object. And then let's select all of the sheets just to make sure that we've got the connection. So we'll just run the get sheets, the same one that we ran last time, the same method. And then within the log, we're going to output the sheets object data. So let's run the make new one and make sure that it's working properly. So everything worked. We selected and we got the sheet. So we've got all of the sheets, and we want to create a new sheet. What name do we want to use? And I'm going to create a variable called new name, and I'll just call it sheet new. So this is the sheet that we're going to be setting up and using. So first we want to check to see if the sheet already exists. So let's select the sheet, and within the spreadsheet object, that's where we've got all of the sheets. Get sheet by name, and we're going to try to select the sheet by our name that we're using, so that's the new name. And if the sheet to null, then we want to create the sheet. So we'll update this and check to see if it's equal to null, and then we create the sheet, and then we're going to use the logger log, and we'll get the index value of it. And within this function condition, we're going to create the sheet, and creating the sheet is done by insert sheet. So you've got a number of options where you can insert content into the sheet object, and we want to create a brand new sheet. So we're inserting a sheet, and we're going to set a value of it to sheet, and that means that we can't set it to const. We need to set it to let, and this is where we're going to be updating sheet. If it's null, then we're going to be inserting the sheet object. And let's run this and check to see if it's working. So make the new one. It's updating and creating the sheet object. So let's see what happened. So it did create sheet number 2. So we also want to set the name to the sheet object. So now that we've got within the sheet object, we can set the name, and this name can be set to whatever the new name was. So that way we're actually going to be setting the sheet name that we want to use. If it already exists, then it's going to select the existing one, and it's not going to create a brand new one. So going into the sheet, so we've got sheet new. Let's move it around and see what index value that we get for it. So this time it didn't create the sheet because it found the sheet existed, and it skipped that condition where we're setting the name and inserting the sheet, and simply just output what the index value of it is. And because we moved it to the first index value, we got a index value of 1. So that's how you can create sheets. And when you are creating sheets, just if you don't want to have them with the same name, just make sure that you are selecting and updating the sheet and checking to see if the sheet name already exists. And if it does, then you can skip creating of the sheet. And the creating of the sheet is done by the method insert sheet. And what this does is it inserts a new sheet into the spreadsheet using a default sheet name, and it automatically actually becomes the active sheet. So once you inserted the sheet, this one is going to be automatically the active one. So if we wanted to select it and use it, we can also use it by the active sheet object. Hey, welcome. In this lesson, we're going to be updating the background colors of the sheets. So setting a bunch of background colors for the selected sheet object. So let's first start out by creating a function. So this function is going to set up and add colors to the sheets. And actually I'll just lowercase that. So add colors to the sheets, and that's the function that we're going to be running. Let's select the spreadsheet object. So using the spreadsheet app, we're going to open by ID and specifying the ID value. And this is where we can place the ID of the spreadsheet. So let's select the ID of the sheet that we want to update and set the background colors. And we're going to also then go through and select the sheet. So we want to do it as alternating rows. So let's select the sheet that we want to use, and we'll just select the first sheet. So using the spreadsheet get sheets, and we're just going to return back and use whatever the first one is that we have. So we can always update the ID and run this script on different sheets as well. And let's create a for loop. So let I equals 0, and we'll loop through. So how many rows do we want to update this on? Let's do 50 rows, and then I increment it by 1. So we're going to start out at the row of 0. And actually, the way that Sheets works is that it doesn't start out at 0, it starts out at row of 1. So let's update this and set it up while it's less than 51. So that will still give us a total of 50 rows. And we want to select the sheet object. So selecting the sheet, and then using get range. And this will allow us to select the range that we want to update. And there's a number of ways to select the range, and in this case we're going to use the notation. So selecting the same way that we see within the sheets. So the columns are A, B, C, D, and the rows are numeric. And that's going to make it easy for us to concatenate the value of I and selecting that row. And then once we've selected the row, we can set the background color, and let's update the background color and set it to be blue. So when you are setting the CSS color, you can use the hex value or the named color values. And it's just giving us an example here of sets the background color of the cells. We're selecting the range that we want to select the background color of, and setting the background color to whatever color has been selected. And in this case, it's a named value of red. So let's go ahead and run the script. So we're going to be adding the colors to the selected sheet. And when we go back to the sheet, so we've added the background color of blue to each one of the sheet cells. And I'm just going to add in a condition that's going to alternate adding in a color to the background of the sheet. So we'll do a condition that we're going to be looking at the value of I and checking to see if there's a remainder. And if the remainder is 0, then we'll set it to one color. Otherwise, we're going to set it to another color. And we can actually set up a value, and I'll just call it back color. And we'll set it as a default value of green. And then we'll update the value of back color. So if there is no remainder, so if it's an even number, we're going to set the back color to red. Otherwise, we'll set the back color to be purple. And then here, we're going to use the variable back color and update the color for the range that we've selected. So let's do a run of this and see what happens. So go back in our sheet, and then we get this type of pattern. So we're alternating setting the background color. And if we update the range that we're setting, so we can set to a specific range. And the way that the range works, so you can use the A1 notation, so it's expecting a string value for that, and returns a range of a specific A notation. So for the A notation, so a range of A1 to D4 is going to be this way, where you can select from the sheet, so specifying the sheet name and then selecting the range, just as you would when you are writing formulas within your spreadsheet, where you can select the sheet and then use the exclamation mark to indicate the range. So let's add that option in. We're going to add in to the range. So how far do we want it to go? We'll set it to E and then add in the +1, so we get the total value for those cells from A to E on the columns, and then we're updating the rows by I, and that's selecting the range, creating the range, and updating the background of the range. So let's see what happens now. So now we've extended the colors that we're setting up, where we've got the A, B, C, D, and E is all included in the range. So let's try one more thing where we're going to make more of a checkerboard pattern, where as we loop through, we'll set up a value for counter, and we'll just add to the counter whatever the value of I is. And actually, we're going to set up counter outside of the loop. So we'll set counter initially to be 0, and then counter will equal itself plus the value of I. And then we're going to use the value of counter instead of I in order to determine the cell that we're setting. And then we also need to have a loop through for the number of rows that we want to set for the columns as well. So we want to have all of the column values. And that means that we need to have A, B, C, D, and E for the output. So first, let's make sure that this is working. And let's set it to pink and yellow and try it out. Do a run through to make sure that it's working with the counter value. So it's actually doing every 2. And the reason that that's happening is that we just need to increase the counter by 1. So we need to decouple it from the value of I. Let's run that one more time. So now we've got the alternating rows, and we want to actually make alternating on the columns as well. So there's a number of ways to do that, and probably the harder way to do that is to create a loop through and then just get the character codes. So we'll do that first, where we're going to set a value of X and set it at 0, and then while X is less than the value of 5, so that's the number of columns that we want to apply this to. And then we want to loop through. So for now, what we'll do is we'll set up and we'll output it to the logger. So let's create a value of val. And we get the character code at. So this is, if you're familiar with JavaScript, this is going to return back a character code value. And now we'll log it out into the log. So we get the value of val, we'll output it into the log. And then add to that, so we have an increment that we're adding whatever the value of X is. So let's run the add colors. And we're looking at the log, the values that we've got within the log. So starting at a value of 65, which is the value for A, we're incrementing by 1. So we can also skip that, and instead of the character code, we can output the character that's at that spot. So taking the value of val and using a string method, we'll get the value of the letter value, and using a string method and from character code. So this is why, if you're familiar with JavaScript, this is going to be familiar for you, that we're using this value, which is 65, and incrementing, and then we're getting the letter value that's being returned back. Instead of returning back the numeric value, let's return back the letter value. And we'll run it one more time. So this way we're constantly getting A, B, C, D being repeated, and then now it's just a matter of inserting and updating this statement with the new letter value. So take the letter value and add it to the value of I, and then we're going to set the background color of it. And then also let's take the counter and add all of this into this condition, into this loop as well. So this will allow us to set a background color. It's going to be alternating. And I'll see what that looks like. So that gives us this checkerboard pattern. And just a quick overview of what we've done within this function. So all we've done is, instead of going per row, we're going per cell, and then we're incrementing the value of the cells using counter, and then alternating the value depending on what the value of color counter is, either pink or yellow, and that's giving us that checkerboard pattern. So there's actually an easier way to do this, and that's when you're selecting the range, you can also use numbers. So there's a number of options for selecting the range, and we'll take a closer look at that in the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to look at some more options for getting the range. And the range is really important because this is an important way that you can interact with the content and the cells. So let's create a brand new function. And I'll call it add colors to. And it's going to be very similar to what we did within the previous section or lesson. And we'll select the spreadsheet that we want to interact with. And then we want to loop through a number of rows. So we want to loop through 50 rows. So starting at the first row with a value of 1. And then we're going to be updating and setting the color. So again, very similar to where we're looping through, we're updating the value of counter. And then that's allowing us to set the background color. So if, for instance, instead of setting the value of the rows, we want to set the alternating value of the cells. So let's set different background colors, and we'll update these to blue and green. And then depending on the value of I, we're going to alternate it and set a background color. Let's define the background color, and we'll set a default value of green for it. And then as we loop through, we're going to update them with the condition depending on if we've got a remainder or not. So that's going to give us the alternating color values. And let's update the value for get range. So when we're getting a range, we can select the row of any and column of any. So there's a number of options here for getting the range. So passing only 2 arguments in the range, we can have numeric values for the arguments as well. So if we want to have the value of 1, and for the column, we can have a value of I. So let's see what happens here. And run the code, and I'll increase this to 10. And we're running it on the same sheet. So we're making an update on the background colors. And I do need to select the right function. So we're updating the background colors. So that's giving us an alternating value for the background colors. And doing it this way, we can also update them and loop through another value for the rows. And also we can have an alternating value for the columns as well. So creating another loop, we're going to set the value of y. So this is going to be for the rows. Or if we want to set rows starting at 1, and loop through while rows is whatever number of rows we want to do, 50, and then increment rows by 1. So that's going to give us that main loop through. And then as we loop through the rows, let's update this I to columns. And we'll loop through while I is less than 10. So we're doing 10 columns. Instead of I, we'll use columns and update the selection of the range. Instead of I, we're going to select whatever value for the rows is. And let's see what this will do. So what do you think this formula is going to do? Where we're starting out with a default value of green, or this could be red. Doesn't matter. We're updating them. And then we're looping through to a count of 50 for the rows. Actually, it should be 51 and 11 for the columns. And this should be rows plural. And then we're checking to see if the columns have a remainder, and if they don't, then we're setting it to blue. Otherwise, we're setting it to green. So let's run the code and see what happens. And that basically, that set all of the alternating colors, green, blue, green, blue, green, blue. And so the challenge for this lesson is, how do we make it a checkerboard like we did in the last lesson by using the numbers for the range. And if we select, and we can set a value called total, so we take rows plus columns, and then we check the remainder on that value. And let's do a quick update on this, and then we'll run that and see what happens there. So because now we're adding the row values, because these are all numeric, to the column values, this provides us an easy way to create the checkerboard pattern on within our spreadsheet, setting the background colors. So go ahead and update your project and use the range, numeric range, by setting the values of rows and columns and selecting the range and then updating the background color. And also, while we've got the range, so actually we'll do one more thing before we conclude. So selecting the range and keeping it within an object, that's going to also provide some more opportunities where we can set the font color, we can set the font size, we can add notes to it, the different formats, the text styles. We can also set the value. And for this, I'm going to set the value of that cell to be total. And let's run through it one more time. And so now we've got the values of total that's being populated within the cells. And as you can see, they are increasing as we're looping through them. So there's incremental values, and that's where we're getting the checkerboard pattern. You can see that with a remainder of nothing, it's red. The even numbers are red. The odd numbers are pink for the background. And we can also update and set font color. So let's set the font color to be white. And then range set font size. So what do we want the font size to be? And we can set different font sizes. So setting the size, my font size, and let's set a default size of 10. And then use this size value to set the font size, and then we'll update it depending on the conditions as well. So let's do a run of add colors to, and let's see what happens. So basically we set the font size, and now let's make it a little bit more dynamic, where we're going to use the font size and we're going to increment and increase the size. So let's update it by columns, and we'll set the my size to equal my size plus the columns. And actually we're going to just set it because we want to keep the my size the same, so we'll increase the size directly within the font size function. So let's see what happens now. So now we've got increasingly incrementing in size, and when you go out to the spreadsheet, you can see that the font size is being adjusted, so it's continuously getting bigger as we're moving along to the different columns. So that's how you can update what it's going to look like on the output, and you can update the background, the fill color. You can also update the text color, the font, you can update the font size. So all of these parameters you can select, and once you've selected the range, that's going to be applied to the content contained within the cell. And then in addition, you can also update the value that's contained within that range. So coming up next, I'll show you how we can update multiple values within the cell. So we saw how we can set one value, but we can also select a range with more than one cell, and we can update values to those as well. So that's coming up next. Hey, in this lesson, we are going to be selecting a range of values. So selecting a range, and then we're going to be updating that range. And we'll just create a function, call it getMyRange. Do the same thing that we've just been working on. So we're going to focus on that same sheet. So selecting it by ID, opening up the spreadsheet and selecting the spreadsheet object, and then selecting the first sheet that's available for us. And what we want to do is we want to select our range. So let's set up another variable, and we'll just call this one range. And selecting the range from the sheet. So selecting the sheet object, and then using getRange, and we can add in the parameters of the range that we want to get. So doing it numerically, we can have up to 4 arguments. So if we have just the one argument, then that's going to select the first cell. And as we saw, so if we have the one argument of 1, and let me close that, and we'll log out into the log the contents of range. And let's get the data values. So range get values, and this is going to be the contents of data. And then we can also visually update range, and we can set the background color and then whatever we want to set it to. So we'll set it to red in this case. And let me quickly go into here. I'll do a quick reset, and we'll set all of the font size the same. And actually, I just want to get rid of those values. I want to set the font, reset that so we can actually see the font, and reset the font size all the same. So now we just have some random values within that sheet. So let's see what this function produces. Run the getRange function. And so this current range is not found. So we can't have a range of 1. It's not an accessible parameter. So if we want to use the notation value, so if we want to use A1 and run, so that will select the range, and that's how we can use the 1 parameter here. But if we're using numbers, we do need to have more than 1. So we can use the numeric range selection, and let's actually select it by row and by column. So if we want to select the second one, we'll do column number 2 and set this one to blue background. And we'll see what the values that's being returned back. And when we do have the plural of get values, so this is going to return the rectangular grid of values for this range. So it returns a 2-dimensional array of values, indexing the row by column. And what that basically means is that's why we've got this array-based data. So if we want it to, because this range could potentially return back multiple rows and multiple columns, so that's why we need to have that multiple dimensional array structure, where when we are selecting the range, so this is again returning back the 2-dimensional array. So each column is going to be comma separated, each row is going to have its new own array. So this is returning back an array of values. And it did say that we have an opportunity to add in up to 4 integers here. So the first one is going to be row, the second one is going to be column, and if we have a third one, then that's going to return back a number of rows. So how many rows do we want to include within this range? And that's starting at 1 and 2 and returning back rows. So let's see if we get 5 rows, and we're going to update all 5 to green and then do a run. So now that's setting up all 5 rows on column B. So this is the range that's selecting within green. And we also have an opportunity to select, actually add in one more parameter, and that's also expecting an integer, and this is the number of columns that we want to go for the range. So this is a block of content, and if we want to do number of columns, so again, it's going to return back columns. So if we want to do 5 columns, and this is the starting point, and then we're going to go down 5 rows and go over 5 columns, including the starting point. So that's going to be where we're starting for the range, and then this is going to be the range dimensions. And turn that, let's update that and set that to be pink. And then we're also picking up all of the values within the range as well. So that's setting it all to pink. That's the current selected range. So just as we're getting values, we've seen before that we can set values. So using the set, so we can set background, but we can also set values. Now the structure of the values needs to be the same as what we've got within the range. So if, for instance, we've got the 1 cell and we're setting the values for it, then it's going to be expecting this type of structure for the range of values, and we need to wrap this into another array because this is expecting a multi-dimensional array. So if we had multiple rows, then we would comma separate out the rows, and if we had multiple columns, then we'd comma separate the columns. So the dimensions when we're setting the values has to be the same as the range, and that's oftentimes that's a little bit difficult sometimes to calculate out. So the larger your range, just make sure that you're able to set the values accordingly, or that you've got the proper array size for the values. So if I was to set 2 rows, then it's expecting 2 rows. We comma separate them, and that's test 1 and test 2. And let's also set a different starting position. We'll set it at column number 3. So let's do a run on that. So now we've got test 1 and test 2. So that's the range that we're selecting, and I could also update that in green as well so that we can distinguish between our previous range selection. So that was this range selection, now in green. And let's do one last one where we'll select the range selection. We'll do it in blue and also add in 2 columns. So now it's expecting this to be comma separated out, and then this as well to be comma separated out. So we'll do test 3 and test 4, and then where do we want to start this? Start it at column number 4. So let's run through that, and now we've got this blue range, and we're able to make updates of the content as long as we've got the same structure for the values. And if you are missing one of the values like this, if you don't have a proper range, it's going to throw an error because it's not going to be able to select the right number of columns, and the data does not match the number of columns in the range. So data has 1, but range has 2. So it gives you a really smart return on the message error that if you are missing, if your range isn't proper, the values that you're setting, it's not matching up with the original range values, then it's going to throw an error, but it's going to give you some good details within that error so that you can quickly debug and sort out what the issue was and the problem was. So go ahead and try this, set some values and set multiple values, and then also set the background to the selected range, and you could be ready to move on to the next lesson. This is going to be a quick lesson on the editor and some of the options that you have with the editor. So we saw in the last lesson that if we're missing and if we try to run the code, we get the execution log, we get information about what happened and what went wrong. We also get the file, so the code GS line number 7, and the problem here is the get my range value. So that's not set properly, and then it gives you the information to debug the error. So also within the code, you're also able to, on a Mac, hold Control and click, and that's going to give you this pop-up window where you've got some more options and some shortcuts, some keyboard shortcuts. And on a Windows machine, you can right-click and you get the same pop-up window. So first we've got the go to definition. So what that does is that looks for a definition on whatever the selected item is. And also when you do select the item, if you wait for a few seconds, you can get the pop-up window that's going to give you information about that selected item. And in this case, I did select the set background. So it gives you the syntax, so color, it's expecting a string value for it. And then you can also trigger this by selecting it. Make sure you get the blue background, and once you've got the blue background, then you can hover back over it and you're going to get the pop-up window. So going into the control, we've got the go to references. So if we do go to references, it's going to show you within the code every time you're referencing this method. So this is a good way to debug as well, that you can easily go through your code and you can see how many times you're using the set background. So you can maneuver through those and maneuver through your code. You also have an option to go to symbol. So whatever the symbol is that we're looking for. So we've got the value variable name of back color. So every time we're using that, we can go to the symbol. So again, doing the pop-up window, we can rename the symbol. So if I was to select a symbol and I've got the back color, and then if I rename this to new backs, it's going to rename it everywhere within the code. So that's a really an easy way if you want to rename some of your variables. Also within the pop-up, you can format the document. So that cleans up the code. Let's mess it up again and do a format of the document. So that realigns it. So basically it's same as one of the beautifier functions within the editor. So this is a really nice addition with this newer version, so that we have a quick way to clean up the code and make it more readable. There's also the cut and copy. So that's another one that's commonly used. And then there's the command palette. So the command palette allows you to add cursor above, add cursor below, and it gives you the keyboard shortcuts. There's also add line comment. So let's select that and do the command palette. Add line comment. So that will automatically do the commenting of the line by using the forward slashes. And this is something similar within JavaScript. So the idea is that you select what you want and then open up the command palette, and then you can apply the different changes to it. There's also the different shortcuts that are available within the command palette. So you can delete, you can cut, you can undo, you can redo. And there really is a really rich number of options that are available. And also when you get familiar with the keyboard shortcuts, that's going to really allow you to speed up your development process. And then you always also have the option of adding in the debugger. So in order to add in the breakpoints, you simply click on the line within the editor itself and then run the code within the debug, and that's going to run the debugger. And from here you can see the different variables that are in use and all the different functions that you can apply to the variables. So it gives you a whole listing of what's available for you, and it gives you a listing of those functions and then what parameters they require in order to make use of those. Also the different data that we've got, and you can see the data. So this is within an array. So if you want to call back the value of test3, you can do data and have array number 1 and then the value with the index of 0 for the array number 1. So let's try that actually and go into the logger log and select the value of data and using the array 0, and then let's return back. And actually this is going to be within the second array. So that should return back test3. And we make changes to the global values. So these are all the global functions and variables that are available for us. So let's stop and restart. And actually I'm going to run this just as regular run. So that way we were able to use the debugger, get some more information on the variable that we were looking for, and then output it and make use of it within the log. And the execution log as well gives you a lot of details about what's going on, what's happening with your script, when it starts executing, when it stops executing, any of the logged information as well. So make use of it, and just as you would if you're developing JavaScript in the console log, as you're developing your code, this is a really useful function with the log, as well as the debugger. In this lesson, we are going to be selecting some of the data from the sheet and looking at the data, counting the available columns where there's data present within the sheet. So let's go ahead and select the sheet object. And this is again from the standalone script that we've been working with before. So let's create a function, test data 1. And then within this function, we're going to select the sheet object and then just select the first sheet. So using the spreadsheet app, let's get, actually it's open by ID, and then we're going to use the ID value in order to open up the object. Let's set up our ID and just get rid of the space and the slash. So that will select the sheet object by its ID. And then if we want to select the first sheet that is available, let's do a get sheets method, and then we want to return the first one. So this is going to return back the first sheet object that is available within the spreadsheet, and I'll rename this to sheet as we're not going to be accessing the SS object anymore. And then let's use the logger and log the sheet object. I'm just going to update the sheet ID number before we try it and save, and we'll run the debug just to make sure they're grabbing the sheet object. So we are able to get the sheet object, and just as before, if we want to get the data that's contained within the sheet, we need to get the range of the data. So let's select the range. And before we actually do, we're going to get some information that's contained within the sheet object. So we want to get information, and within the get options of the sheet, we can get whatever the active cell is. We can get all of this information, and we want to get the last column value. And this is going to return back value, an integer value from the sheet. It's going to get a value in the very last column of the sheet. So they've got an example here, so we can get the value of the last cell. So it's returning back the last row, the last column, and then it's getting the range by last row, last column, and returning back the value of contained within there. So let's do the same thing where we've got the last row value, and we'll set that up by getting the sheet value that's contained for that. And that actually should be last column. So let me just do an update on that. So that's the last column, and then this is the last row. And we're going to use a method that's called get last row. And that's also going to return back an integer. And so now we are able to get the last row and the last column, and save that, and let's execute that, and we'll see what values we've got within the log. So we get the last row at last column at 10 and the last row at 50. Let's go take a look at our data. So we've got A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J. So that's column number 10. And then the last row is row 50. We've got the numeric value there as well. So that means that we can select a range from the data. And let's create a range object. And using the sheet object, using get range. And then the range is requiring the two parameters. So the row comes first. So last row value. And then also the last column value. So those are the symbols that we're using in order to return back the range. And now within the logger log, let's select range and get value of the item. So what the range has allowed us to select the last value that's contained within there. So let's set a value within the spreadsheet. And I'll just say this one, all uppercase. Let's run the script and see if we return that back within the logs. So we did in fact return back the data that's contained within there. So last row, last column. And there's also more information that you can get from the sheet object with the data that's contained within the sheet. So if you want to get all of the sheet data, you can do that as well. And selecting the sheet wherever we've got data. So this is going to select out the range that's corresponding with the dimensions in which data is present. So from the sheet object, if we want to get all of the data, we've got an option to get the data range And this is going to return back the full range of values. And if we log out the range data symbol, we need to use the plural of get values in order to display all of the values that are contained within the range. So this is going to provide us a massive object, a multi-dimensional array with all of the data that's contained within the spreadsheet. And so we can also get the range if we want to get the full data range. I'm going to comment that out. And just as we see with the get data range, when we use the get range, we've got an option to do rows, columns, and then how many rows and how many columns we want to select. So if we were to start at row 1, column 1, and go till the last row and the last column, that's going to return back the same as the get data range. So selecting the range, we'll do the range get values method, and that should have an R in front of it, and save that. So now these should actually produce the same results, because the data range is just the default, and it's the easy way to get all of the available content that's within the spreadsheet. And then correspondingly, the last row and the last column are going to do the same thing. So if we're starting at column and row number 1 and getting to the last column, so the number of rows and then the number of columns, we should produce the same result. So let's see what happens. And it's returned back all of the data that's contained in there. And there's actually probably one question that you're wondering, well, now these cells are nice and neatly, they've got the same amount of columns, same amount of rows of data. So what if, for instance, we have extra cells here, and then we also have some extra cells like this and with the white space. So sometimes within your spreadsheet you might have a format like this. So what do you think is going to happen with the range? And given from what you've just seen with the last column and the last row, what numbers do you think are going to be produced there for those values? And I'm going to log out the last column and the last row again so that we can see the difference here. So the last row, and just return back those values within the log. So what do you think is going to happen with the values that are going to be returned back? And what do you think it's going to do for the blank values? And if you said that it's just going to skip them, but they're still going to be registered within the multi-dimensional array, you're correct. So it added in all of these blank slots for the data that's missing. And the maximum amount of columns is now 12 and rows is 60. So even though some of the rows and some of the columns don't have data, it's going to take the furthest amount. So if we've got some data within row 60, it's going to count all the way to row 60. And now the last column here is going to be this one here. So we've actually moved the dimensions by the columns and the rows. So we've moved it now to L60, and that's where we've got the information for the last one. So if I was to change this to 0, and if we were to get the value of the last row, the last column, let's see what gets produced there. And I'll call it last corner, and taking the sheet, let's get our range, and we're going to just select the one cell. So using the last row and last column values, we're going to select that last row and last column, and let's output the data into the log. So using the logger log, and this one is just going to be the one cell, so we can use the get value method in order to return the contents of that. And let's run it one more time, and just to show that it's actually is getting the content contained within this one, and that's the last column that it's selecting on the range. So let's also take the last corner, and we can set a background of red for it, and we run it so we can visually see where it's seeing and getting the last corner piece. So the bottom right bottom corner of all of the data that's contained within the spreadsheet. So go ahead and try this. Select the data range, and then also get comfortable with how the data range, because it's always going to be a block by the same amount of rows and columns, even if there's no data in there, and determine where the last corner is within the spreadsheet. And you're going to be ready to move on to the next lesson. In this lesson, we're going to be looking at getting the active selection from the spreadsheet object. So whatever is actively selected within the spreadsheet, we want to output that within the console. So let's start by creating a brand new function. And I've actually been logging the previous code. So that's where I've got this previous code. So I've got it all commented out, the previous code. As we go through the lessons, I'm just dumping in more code into the previous code for those of you wondering what previous code GS is. So it's not affecting any of the functionality that we're writing within the code here, within the code GS file. So first, we always need to select the spreadsheet that we want to use. And because we are using a standalone application, we're connecting to the spreadsheet. And then we're also going to show you how this works on a bound application. So a bound script within the application. So set up the ID. And let's select the spreadsheet app. So using the spreadsheet app class, and then open by ID. We're going to open the spreadsheet by its ID. And this time we want to get whatever the active sheet is. So the sheet object itself is going to be changing depending on what the active sheet is. So we're getting the active sheet object, and that's going to determine which sheet that we're using. And also within the sheet itself, we want to get whatever has been selected. So within the, and we'll just call this selected data, or it should be actually selected range. And selecting the sheet, and we're going to get the selection. And just like the other objects that we saw before we try to interact with any of the content, so we've got the selection, but we want to get the selected range. So this is just selected selection. And then in order to get the actual range, so we'll do another variable for selected range. So selected selection, and from here, we're going to get whatever the active range is. So it's going to select whatever that active range is. And then if we want, finally, if we want the data that's contained within there, we get the range just as before. And then we do get values. And that's going to return the multi-dimensional array of all the values that are within the selected range. And that actually should be data. So let's try it, and let's run test number 2 and see what we log out. So we've got a value of 2 for the selected value, for the selected data. And we're looking at that and not 100% sure where that's coming from, because the only value of 2 is within the first cell. So let's just make sure that we're selecting the name of the sheet. So let's log out and do a sheet and get name of the sheet, and do a get name method. So see what sheet is the active sheet. And remember, this is from a standalone script. So it's using the new sheet, or the sheet new. And that's the first one. So let's go in and select, add in some content into new sheet 5 and run the code and see what happens. And notice it still stays on the new sheet. And the selected cell is referring to the first sheet and whatever data we've got within the first sheet. So if we update the sheet order, it's going to update the value of the sheet that we're using and the data that's contained within that first cell. So it's not actually getting whatever the active range is. So let's go ahead and we're going to try this same script, and we're going to open it up and use the bound script in order to do this. So under Tools, Script Editor, and then within the bound script, let's have the same script run, and we're going to run test2 and see what the results are. and we'll make a selection, run it again. So let's make a few updates to the script. So we want to, instead of open by ID, we're going to get the active spreadsheet object. And we won't need the ID anymore for this test. So now let's try it one more time and do a run of test 2 and see what results are being produced. So now we're actually able to get the sheet that we're on and the data that's been selected. So that's the difference between when you're using a standalone script and a bound script and using the active. So you're still able to select active, but it just automatically defaults to the first sheet, and the active cell defaults to the first range area. Now you are able to select an active range area. You can set active sheet, and then we can select a sheet that we want to set as active. So let's say, for instance, we want to set sheet new. The active one, by selecting the sheet object, can get all of the sheets within the array and then select which one we want to set as active. So now we've able to select this one as active, and then now let's update the active range. So where we've updating the selection within the sheet object. And before we set an active range, we need to select the range that we want to use. So let's create a variable called range, and from the sheet itself, we're gonna get the range value, and using the A1 notation, select the range that you want to use. And that's created the range. And selecting the sheet object, now we can set the active range using the range object that we just created. Run the code. Let's see what results got produced. So we're able to select this and set this as the active range. And also, we know from before where we can set the background of the range. So visually to see whatever is yellow is going to be the range that we're setting with the Google Apps script. So that's selected this area and selected the content contained within that area. So you can do it this way where you're setting the active sheet, setting the active range, but when we do have the information, especially on a standalone script, we already have the sheet that we want to use, so we could just get the sheet object, and then we already have the range that we want to use that's already added into the code, so we can skip quite a bit of this. But this is just an exercise demonstrating how you can set the active range, how you can get selections of the content and use that within a standalone as well as within the bound script. And it does make more sense to be using the active selections within the bound script when you're running the code, and when somebody actually has the code, the spreadsheet open, then that's mainly when you're going to be using this the active methods that are available within the spreadsheet. So go ahead, try this out, add it into a bound script as well as a standalone script. This is good practice in order to get more familiar with how to make selections of the ranges and how to set active ranges within your spreadsheet. And before we conclude, we can also get the last row and last column for the selected range. So using the range and then get last row will get me the value for the last row. We can also get the number of rows. So that's another value that we can get from the selected range, get number of rows. And there's also get column and get number of columns. And I'll just do this within an array. So it's a dimension array, and create an array that's going to hold this information, as we've got quite a bit of stuff here for the range columns. And then afterwards, we'll select the range and get last row. And these are all going to be returning back integers. So range and get number of rows method, and close off the array. And then we'll log out the dimension array, and we'll see what's contained within there. So let's run that one more time. And once you have the range, you can use this information, the number of rows, so the last row, And let's look at where we've got the last row is 5. The number of rows is 4. And actually this should be column and get number of columns. So let's try that one more time and run it. That's why it was the same number. So we actually have the last column is going to be 7. So that corresponds with column G, which is the 7th column. And then the range for the columns is that we've got 6 columns. So this way, if you want to select and recreate the selection within a new spreadsheet, you can do that by getting the number of rows and the number of columns, and that will give you the dimensions of the selected range, and that will also allow you to copy it out to a new sheet. So that's coming up next. We're going to do a simple exercise where we're going to make a selection of content and create a new sheet with that content contained within it. In this lesson, we are going to be having an exercise where we're going to be able to make a selection within the sheet and then run a function that's going to create a brand new sheet with the data that we've selected and only the data that we've selected. So let's set that up, and we are going to be using a bound script for this one. So I've got the spreadsheet and I've got my bound script for the spreadsheet. So let's set up the function, and I'll just call it copy me, and it's going to be creating a copy of the spreadsheet information. So setting up the spreadsheet object using the SpreadsheetApp class, we're going to just get the active spreadsheet object and then also get the active sheet. So that will select the sheet object for us to be able to use. And I'll rename this to sheet so it makes a little bit more sense. And just make sure that we can log out the sheet object. And let's run the copy me. So everything is working properly. And usually I do like to run the logs just to make sure that the code is running properly. So now we want to get the selection. So we want to get the selected data from the sheet object, and we want to get whatever the active range value is. And let's log the range out. So run, and returns back the range object. So this can actually be renamed to range. And then if we want to get the selected values, we'll set a variable for selected and using the range, and we'll just get the values that are contained within the range. So run that and we'll see what selection we get. Let's update our selection. Run the code again. And we might also want to take the selected or take the range and set a background color for it. And I'll just set a background color of teal for it. So every time we run the code, whatever we've selected, it's going to get a teal background. Let's run the code again. And we're getting all of those datas. So this is being returned back in a multi-dimensional array. So what we want to do is we want to copy it and create a brand new sheet with that data. So let's set that. We'll create a brand new sheet. So let's get number of sheets. And using the spreadsheet, and actually let's separate this because we want to get the whole sheet object because I want to get how many sheets are available. So separate out the object, and then using the SS, so the entire spreadsheet, get sheets. So it's going to return back number of sheets. And number of sheets is going to have a length. Number of sheets, and let's output the length. So it's going to tell us how many sheets are available, and then we can use that number when we create a brand new sheet. And we'll use the sheet in order to create some name for the sheet. So this is going to be our name. So sheet name, and this is also the one that we're going to search by. So selecting a name, let's create a name. So call it sheet, and then add to the sheet whatever the num sheets length value is. So this will create a new sheet with whatever the new number is. And of course, if you've already created sheets and if you've deleted some sheets, then this count is going to be off and it's going to be reproducing a new sheet. So what we also want to do at this point is check to see if the sheet exists. And if it already exists, then we want to clear out whatever the existing sheet is and copy that information over to it. So we've got a brand new sheet name, and we want to select the new sheet by using the sheet object and get sheet by name and using the name of the new sheet. This will allow us to select the new sheet, and it's expecting a string value. So get the sheet by the name. It just as before. Now we can check to see if new sheet, and if it is equal to null, then that means that we need to create a brand new sheet with this new name. So creating the sheet object, we're going to insert sheet, and then the new sheet object, we're going to set the name to it. So set name of the new sheet to the sheet name that we just created. And then what we ultimately want to do is copy the content into that sheet. So let's run, and it created the new sheet. So sheet number 3. Run it again. Should create sheet number 4. So it's adding in sheets. And otherwise, the new sheet and clear the contents of the sheet. So I'm just going to add some content into sheet 4 and delete out one of the sheets. So now when we run the script, it should try to create sheet 4, but it's going to see that it's already there, and it will clear the contents contained within that sheet. So it cleared out the contents, but notice it kept the styling. So there's also another option for the new sheet, and if we want to clear out the styling as well, so clear formats, run that one more time. So it cleared out the formatting, and there's also a new sheet that we can do, or just clear method. And let's add in some content into sheet number 4 and run that one more time. And notice what's happening here is that when we're setting the background, because this is the new active object, we're setting the background of it to be teal. So that range that we selected here earlier, that range now is no longer the active range, and the active range is going to be wherever the cell currently is, and that's why we're getting that teal background being set on that. So in order to fix that, we need to set the teal background whenever we've selected the active range, and I'll update this to purple. And that way, when we run the script, we're not going to end up with that active cell being updated. I'll move the logger up. Going over to the sheet where we've got the data, just do a reset. So we've got all as just default white background, make a selection, and then run the code that's been selected. So we've got a multi-dimensional array with data, and we want to drop that data into the new sheet. Let's select the range and get the range values. So within the range itself and the range dimensions, get the number of rows, and then there's also get the number of columns. So create a variable for new range, and within the new sheet, we want to get range, start at 1, 1, where we want to paste the content, and use the original range number of rows and number of columns in order to set the dimensions for the range and get the number of columns. And these are methods. So add in the rounded brackets. So that's our new range. And then new range, let's set values and use the values that we've picked up from the original selection of data. Because we've calculated out the range that we need within the new sheet, and now we can set and add that content. So going in to what we want to select, and then run the code. And within the new sheet, we've copied the content into that new sheet. And I'll delete out and try it a few more times just to make sure that it is working properly. So it's creating a new sheet with the selected content, and then it's updating that selected content and setting it purple. And again, creating another new sheet with the updated content. If the sheet name exists and we select content from that sheet, we run the code, it will update the existing sheet with the new content. And in order to read this better, you can create a new function in order to separate out your logic that you have within the sheet. So let's create a new function. And this function is just going to be creating a sheet. So we want to have data that we want to drop into the sheet. And we might also want to pass in the spreadsheet object so we don't have to redefine it. So we've got the data, the spreadsheet object, and selecting the number of sheets and the data that we want to use. I'll rename this to data. And we can run it as a function from the content that we've selected. So passing in the SS object, passing in the data object, and we also need to pass in the original range because we're using that range value, or you could separate out the values. There's just another way of representing the content and structuring it using separate functions in order to accomplish that. Update that to red, and let's try it out. So going out to where we've got the sheet content, we want to run, and it looks like we do have a error there within the code, and that's just defined as data. Let's try it one more time. So select the content, go over to the sheet, and just make sure that the content's being copied into the sheet. And you're ready to move on to the next lesson. We're going to be adding a custom menu option to our spreadsheet. So this is going to be on the bound script, where we've got the script open here within the script window, and this is a bound script to the spreadsheet that we've got the name of as test. So opening up the bound script, and the reason this only works on the bound script is because it needs the active object where it runs the function whenever it's open. So display the menu, the user opens the file, and we write the code within the onOpen functions. And there are a few other reserved functions within the Google Apps script. So onOpen will automatically by default fire off whenever the spreadsheet is opened. And we want to select the UI object from the SpreadsheetApp class. So selecting the SpreadsheetApp and using getUI will return back the user interface, the UI method, and return back the UI object. And now within the UI object, and this is also available within the document app or the form app. So those are two additional options where you can select the UI object. So within the UI itself, we've got a number of options. So we can do alerts, prompts, and we can also create menus and create add-on to the menus. So what we want to do is create a menu. And this value that we've got, the caption value, is going to be the name that's going to be contained within the menu. So right next to the help option within the spreadsheet, we want to create a brand new menu, and we'll create it new options. So that will be our menu name. And then for this object itself, we can add items, separators, submenus, and then lastly, we add it to the UI. So the add item requires two parameters. So the first one is going to be a caption or a string, and the second one is going to be a function name. And this is also represented by a string. So let's create a function first, and this will run the function with the name of first. Add some more items to the UI and set it up to run the function called second. Let's add a separator. So that's the separator bar between the items. Add another item. So this one is going to actually have a sub menu, and within the sub menu we're going to use the UI object and create a menu within there, and I'll give it a name of just sub. So it's going to be the sub menu. And then just as we've been adding within the main menu, as we've got objects, we can add options here within the sub menu as well, and then these can run different functions. So if we've got a third, fourth, and so on function, And then going out to the parent, we can add a fifth one, and this will run the function fifth. And then we need to still create all of the functions. And so once we've done constructing the menu, we just add to the UI. So use the method to add the object to the UI. Let's create our functions. So we created a number of functions that are going to run. So we've got the first function here, and that will just say ran first. And we can add additional content within these blocks of code to do even more stuff. And I believe we had a function second, we had a function third, we have a function fourth, and we have a function fifth. And let's double check, and I should actually second, third, fourth. So save, and creating all of the functions that are going to run within the UI menu. So let's go back out to the spreadsheet and just going to refresh it. So this function, the onOpen, is automatically going to run. So it's running in the background, and as you see that it's got the working option. And then once it finishes running the Google Apps script, we get this new options menu being added to the menu bar. So you can select that, and that's where we've got all of the functions. So we've got first, it's running the first function, it's running second function, and then we've got the third and fourth. So let's introduce some additional functionality here. So we don't get anything within the execution log that the functions are actually running, but we do see that they are running here and that the script is finished. And I'm going to create a function. I call it log out. It's going to take in the one parameter and a value. And then selecting the spreadsheet object, and just get the active spreadsheet and get the active sheet when it's running. And within the active sheet, we're using a method called append row, and that's going to append a row of content, so whatever the value of val that's been passed in. So that will allow us to log out the content. Instead of the log, update these to log out, and this way visually we're going to see which functions are run, and we're also going to see the result of the content that's being run. So going over to fairly blank sheet, see what happens. So now every time we run the functions, we're updating whatever spreadsheet we're on, and we see that the functions are actually firing off and they are being run. Do that within the sheet, another sheet as well. So whatever the active sheet is, we're able to run the functions. So go ahead and set up this simple example, and I've got some more items that we're going to be looking at in the next lesson having to do with the UI. And the UI is designed to be run for bound scripts, and it will work on the document app and the form app. Hey, welcome to our exercise challenge, and in this lesson we're going to create a custom log. So within the spreadsheet, we're going to create a new sheet called log, and if it's already there, then whatever we're selecting, we're going to automatically copy to the next available row within the log sheet. And we're going to do that by adding a UI option, just as we did in the last lesson, and then making that selection, copying it and pasting it to the log. So let's begin and creating the function on open. So whenever the spreadsheet is opened, we're going to get the UI object. So using the SpreadsheetApp class, get the UI object, and that will allow us to use the UI object and create a menu, and I'll call it advanced. And then within the menu, let's add an item. So it'll just be one option there to copy, and then this will copy to log. So that's the function that we're going to run within this. And then lastly, let's just add it to the UI. So just do a really simple on open there. And now let's create the function, copy the selected contents to the log. So let's first make the selection of the content, and using the spreadsheet object, we're going to get the active spreadsheet, and then get the active sheet and the range that we want to select. From the spreadsheet, we want to get the selection, and then also get the active range from the selection. And the data that we want to copy is going to be from the range. And if we do get values, that's going to return back the values that are contained within that range. So let's now check to see if there's a sheet object within the SS. And let's just separate this out. And I'll call it sheet log. So within the SS object, we're going to use get sheet by name and try to select a sheet with the name of log. And if the sheet log is equal to null, so it doesn't get returned, we need to create a sheet. So take sheet log and then insert a new sheet using the insert sheet method. And taking the sheet log object, let's set the name of the sheet log to log. And that way, if we have the sheet, then we can just use the sheet, the existing sheet. And if we need a new sheet, then we're going to create one with the new sheet name of log. So next we need to select where the available range is. So let's create that new range value. And within the sheet log, this is where we want to check to see the range. And using the active range, we'll select all of the available content within that sheet, setting up a start row. From the new range, we can get the number of rows using the number of row method. And let's create one more range. And this is going to be the range for the new data that we're going to be inserting. So within the sheet log, get a range. And the range that we're setting is going to start on whatever the row value is where we want to start. Start at column number 1. And then using the original range selection, get the number of rows, and then also using the original range, get the number of columns and save. So now within the set range, which is the new range, we can set the values, and the range dimensions are going to correspond with our original selection range, and we've got the values that is sitting within data. So do a save, and let's try out the log function. So now we should be able to, we need to actually update the menu UI. And another way to do the menu UI, to do an update to it, is you can just select the function and run it within the app script editor, and that we're just going to update the menu within the spreadsheet without having to refresh it, because when you refresh it, you got to go back to tools and open up the editor again. So we've got the option for copy. We're running the script. We've created a log, and we've copied the content that was selected. So let's select some more content, go to advanced, hit copy, and pop over to log. So whatever content we're selecting, we can copy into our log, and it gets dropped into the log content. And even if we are within the log as well, yeah, let's try that one more time. And it looks like there is a bug in the application where the row that is being set is not going to be the row where the next available content should go. So we need to make an update on that and do some debugging for the application code. So let's do a quick debugging of the application. So let's select the range and set the background to be red. And this is going to automatically show us where the values are going to be going. So it's going to be updating it to red. And also let's output the start row within the logs. So within the sheet log, we're going to append a row. And the row value that is going to be contained within this appended row is going to be whatever we've got for the start row value. And this way we can better visualize and see what's happening here with our selection for our copy to log. And now let's make a selection of some of the content, run the code for the script. And what's happened is that we've set the value where the row that it's starting with is 3. So that's not going to be correct because we want to actually start it down on row number 50. So that would be the next available row. So we're returning back a value of 3. So let's do some debugging and see why start row is getting a value of 3. And that's because we're using the get number of rows. So we need to be using get last row value. And now the start row should be corresponding with whatever the next available slot is within the logs. Let's clear up some of this content here and clear up the background, the fill color as well. And I'll make some selections of the content and copy it. And then we'll test it out to see if it's working properly. So it looks like it's started in on row number 12. Let's try it one more time over here. And this time it started on row number 22 and posted the content there within the row number 22. The append row finds the next available slot. So that's where we've got the value of 22. And try to post one cell. And the problem is another function here that we need to update, another method. So we're using the get active range, and we should be using the get data range instead. So that will select out the entire data range. Let's clear up the content within the logs. Actually, it'll completely remove out the log sheet and start again from brand new, where we run the copy, should create the log, and then copy the log content, turn it red, and now hopefully whenever new content we're adding in is going to be automatically copied to the next available slot. So that copies it to the next available slot, and we see the row that it started on. Let's grab some blank content and see what happens. So we'll do a copy of the blank content. So it copies the blank content properly and has the starting row of 14. So now we don't have any missed spacing, and we've got the log copying out the content just as it is selected. So whatever content we've selected, whatever the dimensions of the selected range are, they're going to automatically be posted. And the append row is just giving us whatever the last starting row was. And the reason that this is being overwritten is that the number of rows, as we can see here with 30, is returning back the number of rows as 30, but it's also the starting point where we're getting the new range where we're writing to. And we're also setting that to our starting row. So if we want to update and add to the number of rows, we can add 1 to the number of rows. And now we're going to keep the last value that was posted there, and then we're just going to keep appending to it. So starting row of 62, and that way our last row we're adding 1 to it to accommodate for the appended row value. And try out the application. If you have any errors or issues, debug the application, make sure that the methods are working properly. If you have to output the content, output the variables into the spreadsheet so that you can easily see and be able to better determine what might be causing the issues. In this lesson, we're going to have a pop-up alert. So again, with the UIs, where we're able to open up and add to the UI and create an alert. So we need a way to trigger the alert, and we're going to do that with the onOpen and run the onOpen function and select the UI. So within the UI object, and using the SpreadsheetApp get UI, so getting the UI object, and then from the UI object, using the create menu, and just give it a name of advanced, and then add item. And we're going to be launching an alert. So this is going to be a UI alert, and creating a pop-up alert, and then add to UI. So add in the UI menu to the spreadsheet, and creating a function called pop-up. And within this function, we're going to again select the UI object with the Spreadsheet app and get UI. And we're going to create a pop-up alert. So getting a response back from the alert object. So using UI, creating an alert, and we'll ask in a question. So it requires, the alert is a dialog box that pops up, and you can have a series of buttons that are available for the user and allowing them to provide a response to maybe a question that you're asking. Do you agree? And you also have an option to set an alert title. I'll give it a title of confirm, comma separated out. And then the third parameter is going to be the buttons. So within the UI, you have an option to set buttons. And using the default button set object, we've got a number of buttons that are available. So we can have an OK button, OK cancel, yes, no, cancel. So let's add in the yes, no buttons within the UI. And this is going to be within the pop-up alert. And we can also set a condition on the response. So if the UI button that's pressed is equal to yes, then we can log some of the information. And we'll do that where we're going to log it directly within the spreadsheet. So let's create another function, and I'll just call it log for the value. And I'll call it actually log value. So within the log value, we're going to send a parameter of yes was pressed, else, and we'll log it the value that no was pressed. And just make sure that we do have a sheet that has a value of log. So selecting the sheet using the Spreadsheet app, we're going to get the active spreadsheet, get sheet by name. The sheet that we want to select is going to be with the name of log. And then within the spreadsheet, append row, and then whatever value, and this is expecting an array. So that's why we've got it wrapped within the array. So we've just got the string value wrapped within the array. And this is going to append to the log. And I'm going to clear the contents of the log, just do a quick reset of it. And let's run the on open so we can update the menu. And now we've got an option called alert. Do you agree? Yes or no? Let's see what happens. So yes was pressed, alert, and press no, and no was pressed. So it's running the script depending on the condition. And we're able to log whatever was pressed into the spreadsheet so that we can see what action was taken. And you can run whatever block of code you want within these conditions. And we'll do one more where we're adding the log. And if we log the response itself, you see that the value is being returned back as yes. So you can also check to see if the button response rep is equal to a string value of yes. And if you are familiar with JavaScript, there are options for the alert, and then also within JavaScript there's an option for a prompt. So let's do a quick update, and this one is the alert. So let's do one for prompt, and then we'll add in similar functionality, but this is going to be for the prompt, and we'll call it popup2. So that's going to be the function that we're going to run, and we're going to get the similar to where the popup1, we're getting the UI object, and prompt as well lives within the UI object. And for the response value, we can take the UI, add in a prompt, and within the prompt, we've got an option to display a string value. So this is like the question that we're asking for the prompt. So add in the question that you want to ask. And by default, there's already going to be buttons set within the prompt. So it's going to be an OK button or a close button. So depending on if the response, and if we do a get selected button, so this is whatever button was selected, is equal to UI button OK, then we can log the content of the response. So just returning back whatever the response text was. So we need to get the response text using the get response text method. And otherwise, this was closed. So we'll just log out that prompt closed. And we'll do one more log value. We're going to log out the selected button. So let's try that as pop-up 2. Run the on open, so it adds it to the menu. And try the prompt option. So it asks us for our name. Hit OK. And the button that was pressed is OK. And the value that was added there is Lawrence. Let's try one more. And this time we're going to close. So the button that was pressed was the closed, and we track in the prompt was closed. As soon as we hit OK, we register the OK button, and we track it as tester. And you can see the response value for the UI button OK. So if the selected button is OK, then we output the text. Otherwise, we track it and log it as prompt was closed. With prompt as well, you can set the buttons. So by default, it's just the close and the OK button. But we have an option to set different buttons. So if your question is, and I'll update this, set that to pop-up 3, and tell me your name. So if our question is, do you like something, which has a yes or no answer, we also have an option to add the UI buttons. So the button set, and we can set the different button set options. So using the button set, the UI button set, and there should be a dot there. So the UI button set, and we can select from the yes, no, cancel buttons, and that will give us those 3 options as buttons. And we can log in whatever the selected button is. And instead of OK, because we don't have an OK button anymore, we've got a yes, no, or cancel. And we'll ask rate 1 to 5. Do you like AppScript? Rate 1 to 5. So that's what is going to be, we're asking the user to provide. And we'll check to see if the response button is no, but we're also going to track the rating there as well. So if the response button is no, and we can add something like that. And then otherwise, if they've closed it, and we'll just track in that the user canceled. So let's try out pop-up number 3. Run it again so it gets added to the menu. And try the prompt option number 2. Do you like AppScript? Rate 1 to 5. So it's rated a 4. Hit yes. So it's going to track that user rated a 4. Let's try it again. And this time we're going to rate it a 1, but we're going to hit no. So no, user rated a 1. And then we'll try the last option. We actually have 2 last options, so we can cancel. And that just has user canceled. And then also we've got the option to close. So user canceled as well. So close and cancel are going to provide the last condition, the else condition, and yes and no are going to write whatever the user rated, what rating was provided within the prompt. So this gives you some opportunity and some options to interact with the user using the UI menu within the spreadsheets, and this also will work within docs and within the form. This lesson we're going to be showing how we can do a modal dialog. So let's make some updates to the code that we were working with in the last lesson. So show modal and do show modal 1. And we'll select the function called modal 1. And I'll update these existing ones. And we're going to need the UI. Can get rid of the other 2 pop-up messages, and we're also still going to be using the log value function that we created in the last lesson. So we've got our UI, and we want to return back a modal dialog. So we need to have some HTML, or we can create some HTML, and using the HTML service, this allows us to create an HTML output. We can also create HTML from a file, use a template for a file. So I'll show you a little bit more about that later on. So this one is just going to create the HTML on the fly. And I'll just say hello world within the HTML within an h1 tag. And tested. So maybe we want to have a paragraph here. So you got to write out all of the HTML if you're generating it like this. And it's a lot easier when you're going to be using a template file. So we'll do that afterwards. We also have an option to set the height and width of the HTML pop-up object. So within the HTML, let's set the height of that value. So this is a pixel value, so how many pixels high do we want it? We can also take the HTML object and set a width, set a title, set a favcon. So there's a bunch of options there that we can set. So setting the width, and we're going to set it at 800 pix for the width of that object. And then lastly, we want to just display it out on the screen. So taking the UI option, we've got a number of options here for show dialog method. We've got the show modal dialog, show modal less dialog. So a few that we can look at, and it's expecting a few parameters, and one is going to be the HTML output, and the other is going to be the title. So let's try it and add the modal option to the on open, and we need to review the permissions. So let's make sure that we do set the permissions for the modal to run, as it's using the HTML service. So that's why it's asking us for additional permissions. So we're using the service class and added into the menu. So let's do a show modal. So that generates the modal. There's our title of test 1. There's the content h1 tags and the paragraph tag. So that's all output using the modal 1. So you're able to create the user interface, update the title, and then also specify the size. So the show modal less dialog is a dialog box in the user's editor. And what this does is it does not suspend the server-side script like the dialog open does. So let's run that as an example as well. So add that and do a show modal 2, and we'll duplicate the function for that. Let's go ahead and add it to the menu. So we'll run the on open, add that option to the menu, and now let's duplicate this function. And with here, we'll also create the HTML. So this is going to be running the show modalless dialog, and it requires the HTML parameter. And then also we can set a title as well for the show modalless. And now let's try the show modalless. And as you can see, the difference really is that we're still able to select content behind, whereas whenever we do the show modal, this content gets grayed out, so we're not able to interact with it. So modal-less and then the modal, that's the difference between the two. There was also a third one, and the show dialog is a deprecated method, so preferred not to use it anymore, but it is still available. So in case you're wondering what it does, it actually does the exact same thing as the show modal less dialog, so it's going to look the exact same. And this is just requiring the output, the user interface, and this is just going to be showing the dialog. And I've included it, but this one is deprecated, so not in use anymore. With the HTML that we're creating and outputting, we can also get that information from a template file. And that's one of the nice things about the app script, is that you can really easily add HTML templates. So I'm going to give it a name of temp. And then going into the HTML template, let's add in that hello as an H1, and you can have whatever HTML you want running, and we'll save that. So this is going to be our HTML. So instead of creating the output from output file, we're going to generate the HTML. So let's define our HTML, and using the HTML service, we're creating the output from file, and we can also use a template file. So using the method create HTML output from file, it requires the one parameter, and that's going to be the string name of the file, and this will allow us to generate the HTML from that HTML file that we just created. So let's try that out and go over to run the modal 2. And remember, this is now coming from the HTML file. And because this is an HTML file, it just runs regular client-side script. So if we had a style value here, and let's select the body and add some properties such as the background and set the background color to be red. Let's test it out in the modal 2. And now we get straight HTML being generated from the template file. And this also goes along for the script tags. So we can use and run some JavaScript and make updates to the code if we want. And we'll just select the H1 and update the inner HTML. And that's just some JavaScript where we're selecting the element from the page and updating the HTML of that element. So let's try that one more time. And we're running the JavaScript, so that's updating the content within the HTML. So we can have whatever JavaScript we want running within the HTML file that we've just created. So we're creating output from a file. And the difference between the output from a file and the output from a template is that if we have a template, we can get app script content running within the template. So let me give you a quick example of this, and there's going to be a whole lot more on this later on. So if we were to select and use const, so let's declare a global variable, so testing global value, and if I want to output that value within the template, I can do that as well when I'm constructing the HTML. And using the HTML service, we're going to create template from file, and we'll just give this one a name of temp1. And for the templates, we need to evaluate in order to render out the content. And let's go ahead and create HTML. Let's call it temp1 HTML. Call it temp1 and save it. And now let's run modal 1. So it's producing the templated content, and within the templated content, we can use scriptlets. So this looks similar to PHP, but it's not PHP. And basically connecting to what we've got within the Google Apps script. So let's say, for instance, we want to get this value being output. We can add that value in the output of the HTML template, and it's going to get evaluated and executed. So now when we go to modal 1, we're getting the value, and that's coming from the Google Apps script. So we're getting a full communication, and this is done with the template from file where we need to evaluate. And within the modal, now we're running a script that's able to run its own script on the client side and connecting content that we've got from the Google Apps script. So a number of options for the modals and also for using the HTML service to generate HTML code. So try it out. And there's going to be more on this coming up in the next lesson when we look at the sidebar. In this lesson, we're going to be running and showing the sidebar. So let's make some updates to our code. So instead of show modal, it'll say show side, and we'll just give it a function name of side1. And let's update some of this content that we have here. So this can just be side1. And for now, I'll just create the dialog, and we'll update that to show the side menu. So again, selecting the UI for the output of the content, and we want to create HTML output. So create HTML output content, and adding this to the sidebar. So instead of the shows dialog method, we do the show sidebar method. And this just simply requires the HTML output for the sidebar. So let's do an update on open with the run and show the sidebar. So sidebar shows up here on the right hand side. We also have the option to add the HTML file. So just as we saw last time, where we can add in the HTML file that we can construct from the template. So instead of creating the HTML output, let's create HTML output from a file, and the file that we're going to use is going to be temp. And option number 3 is going to create it from the template. So from temp1, so instead of creating the output, we need to create the template from a file, and that's going to be under temp1. And whenever we use the templated service, then we need to include the evaluate method in order to evaluate any code that might be present there. So if you don't include the evaluate, it's not going to work. So make sure that you do include the evaluate. And let's add these sidebars to our UI option, and then we'll update the UI menu, and we'll try them all out and see what happens. So let's select that and run the on open. So adding it to the menu bar, so under advanced, so we've got our sidebar 1, so it's running just the straight HTML from the template file, and that's also uploading and running the JavaScript code where it's updating the heading contents. And then also we've got the template value that's coming in from the Google Apps Script global value for the variable that we're selecting and we're running the code. So those are 3 other ways that you can get and update the content. So let's make it a little bit more dynamic, where this global object, where we'll set another global object, and I'll call it counter, and this is going to be a numeric value. And every time we have a pop-up window, so every time we call to this, we're going to update counter by 1. And then within the template, we'll have an H2, and within the H2, we'll have that updated value for the counter. So what do you think is going to happen here whenever we press the show sidebar 3? It'll run the script, and it's going to track the global count value. And the reason that it's not updating is because every time it's running the script, the counter is reset to 0, and every time we update it by 1, it's still at 0. So we actually need a better way to update this counter, and that's where we can use the properties store. And I'm going to be going over this in more detail later on, but just for this example, that we can actually store the value, so we can set a value and we can get a value. From the document properties store, we can also use the script properties, so we can set a property within the script. And then there's also user properties. So there's different ways to store values. And if we want to store the values within the document, so every time the document is used, we're going to use the document properties. So we want to assign a value to the global counter value, and using the properties service, this is going to allow us to tie together a variable within the document that's always going to be available, so it's globally stored within the properties service of the document. So we can always reference that and get back to the properties. And because in this case we were just resetting the value back to 0 every time the script was running, we weren't getting the results that we were expecting. So let's select the get document properties and get property. And in order to get the properties, we want to get a count value. So we can give it a property name, and we'll just call it count like that as a short. And this is going to reassign the value of the counter and update the counter value. And then what we also want to do is we want to use the properties service and get document properties. And we also want to set the property to the new value. So set the property of the count, and then just comma separate it out and to whatever the global value of counter is going to be. And also we want to set this property within the document properties whenever the document opens. And I'm going to set this value to a value of 0 so that whenever we run the setup process, whenever we do the onOpen, it's going to count how many times we've clicked it on this particular run of onOpen. So let's run onOpen. And now we've registered within the document properties a property CNT, and we can use that CNT property to update the content, and that's just going to be output to the modal. So let's try it out. So show sidebar 3. Now we've got a value of 1, value of 2, and it's incrementing in value. So it's tying the values together using the properties service. And then if we do reopen the document, it's going to reset the count back to 0. And if we do a sidebar show, now our value is back at 0. We've clicked it twice and the number's incremented to 2. And this will also work across the modals. So the property service stores the value within the document properties. So it's a document property store that the script can access and make use of. And there's a few other options for the properties service that we're going to look at later on in the course. This lesson we're going to be working with a standalone script. So we're going to be adding in and updating to a spreadsheet. So let's select the spreadsheet and the one that we want to use. Let's create a brand new sheet that we're going to be using. And I'm going to give it a name of test, and we're going to be selecting this sheet and testing the content within the sheet. So adding in to the content, we're going to do numbers from 1 to 10 just within the first row, and then we're going to be appending to it and updating to it. So creating the function, and I'll call it add content. And so that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be adding content. Let's get the ID of the sheet. So this is a standalone sheet script where we need to select the sheet that we want to use. So let's go ahead and select the spreadsheet object. So using SpreadsheetApp, and then open by ID, specifying the ID value that we want to open it by. And then also within the sheet that we want to use, within the spreadsheet object, and we're going to be using get sheet by name, and the sheet that we want to select is test. And within the log, I'm just going to log out the sheet object just to make sure that we've selected it properly, and just run the code. And we have selected the sheet object properly, so just a quick confirmation of that. And what we saw before is that with the append row, this makes it really easy to append content to the spreadsheet. And it's expecting it within array format. So if we had an array and we had some values within the array, so they could be string values, they could be numbers, and just comma separate them out for the different columns. So it's expecting an array because the array is the contents of the entire row, and we also saw how the output of the content, so each row is within a multi-dimensional array. So when we're appending the rows and we're adding in just the one row, then it's just expecting one row of content, and it's separated out by the columns. And that's comma separating out the content of the columns. So let's go into test and we'll see what happens. So we added in an additional row there at the bottom. And if we wanted to as well, we could dynamically set using the sheet and get last row value. So this is going to return back an integer value. And now run that one more time. So now we're counting the number of rows. So every time we run the function, it's going to add in a new row. So counting the number of rows that we have and adding and updating to it. So let me remove this. And also I'm going to add 1 to it so that we're counting this entry as the new entry. So we're adding 1 to the row because the current get last row is taking whatever the value of the last row is. So if we've got 12 rows, then our last row is going to be 12. So that's where we're going to be duplicating the value of 12, and we want it to be incrementing by 1, so we want it to be 13. So let's take a look at some other options that we have for adding content. And we have an option for inserting row. So selecting the sheet that we want to insert to and inserting the row. So we have an option to insert a row before. So that's one of the options. It's expecting before position. So this is an integer value of where we want to insert it before. So let's insert a row of before 5. And we'll do the append row afterwards to see what happens. So we're inserting a brand new row before position number 5. And let's run the code. So it added in a brand new row, but we still appended a row here at the bottom. And it's still being counted as a row, so I do need to keep that and move that to the bottom. And we'll run the code one more time. So that way we're in line with what the row value is. So we've got a row value of 17. The number of rows is going to be 16, and then we're adding 1 to it, so we're adding it in as 17. So if we want to add content into the newly created row that we've created, let's create a variable. And this can just be start position. And selecting the start position, let's set a value of 5 to it. So this way when we're inserting a row before, and if we want to populate the content of the row before, let's add in some content, and we can do this by setting the value, getting the range. So sheet get range, and the range that we want to set is starting at row position, and this is where we can use the start position value, because remember we've added in 1 before, so now this is going to have that new start position value. And setting the start position and starting it out at column number 1, so that's going to be the range. And then using set value, we can set a value of this object and set it to before. And just as we've done the insert before, if we want to insert one after row number 5, let's insert row after and specify the start position. And for the new sheet value that we're going to be setting, we're going to do start position with 1, and that's going to add in content afterwards. So let's try running the code and see what happens within the sheet. So we've got before, we've got after, so we updated 5. Let's clear out some of this content here so we still have all of the values sequential. And I'll update this as well so that we have increasing numbers, and it's a lot easier to tell where we're inserting before and after. So run the code to add the position. So number 5, we've got before, and that just bumped everything up, and after, so we've got the value of number 5 there. So it should actually be sitting after the number 5. But remember now, because we're adding it before, we need to increment it by 1 as well. So let's go back to the code. And we've added 1 before. So you can also change the order of this. And let's do a reset of the content. And then also select one as the start position. So whatever the start position is, let's add in the value, and we're going to reassign the value of whatever is there, and we're going to set it as start. And this is just whatever start position is. Let's first get the start value so that we're not overriding it, we're just concatenating to it and just getting whatever value is contained within that cell. And then adding the value of start to it. So we'll do that. And now let's run the code. So the start was 5. We added a row before. We added a row after, before and after the start position. So the start position, because we went before, it incremented it, so it moved it to 6. Afterwards, still was after the original start position, which was 5. So we added in after first, and then we did the before so that the rows weren't shifting down. If we do the before first, then that means the rows shifted down and that our calculations would be slightly off. So that's how you can insert content before and after, and also append rows. So I do have a quick challenge before we conclude, and this is going to be to update the first row, add in a new row above all of the rows. And instead of append row, it's going to work like a prepend of the row. So it's just a function in order to do that. So go ahead and set that up, and I'll walk you through the solution for that coming up. So the objective of this lesson is to create a prepend function that's going to prepend content just as append adds it to the last available row after the content. We want to prepend it. So we want to shift all the content down and add some content here at the top. So adding in content at the top, and then also adding in content at the bottom. So that's the exercise, and that's the application that we're going to be building, the mini application that we're building in the upcoming lessons. Google does have the function, the append row, but there is no function prepend row, so we're going to create one in this exercise. So that's adding in content, and above the other content, we're going to be still using that same test sheet that we did in the last lesson, and adding the content above all the other content. So let's create a function in order to handle that. So the function can just be called prepend. I'll call it prepender. And we're going to pass in and get the content value that we want to prepend it with. So whatever we want to prepend the row with. So this can be an array value that we're going to be prepending with. And now let's select the sheet. So open it by ID, get the sheet by name. So do all of the same stuff here where we're selecting the sheet object. And we can also pass in the sheet itself as a variable within the parameters. So that way we don't have to select that object once again. And prepending the value. So let's insert our row at the top. So select the sheet object, insert row, and we're going to do insert row before, and whatever the first row is. So we're going to insert a row before, and that's going to be where we can set our content. And then within the sheet object as well, get the range for the sheet. And let's select the range. So starting at 1, 1, because remember we've inserted before 1, so that's just added in a new sheet in the beginning. And within the value, we want to get the length. So we want to set our row value. So we're doing 1 row. And then for the val, let's get a length since this is going to be an array. So that's going to be setting up our range. And we'll create a variable to hold the range. And now within the range, we can set the values of the content within the range. And the values of the content are going to be whatever's contained within the array. So now it's expecting an array value within the prepender. So let's try it out, and we'll create another function. Instead of having the add content, and we'll just do add content to. We'll call to that function. And instead of appending row, we'll append and prepend the same content. So we'll add in the new content within the temporary array. So sheet prepend is already existing, and within the prepender, we need to send over the array and then whatever the sheet value. And this is actually expecting a multi-dimensional array. So when we are setting values, we've got an array within an array. So let's try running the add content and go and see what content got added. Let's clear out what is existing currently and set up some new content. and we'll run the function one more time. So we should be prepending and adding content to the end. So within the prepend, we'll take the val array and push content into it. So we'll push a value of start. And then before we append the row, we'll add in a value of end. So it's a little bit more clear, and so that we've got some distinct values that we're adding there. And this is also going to demonstrate that it's dynamic, that even if we've pushing in an array, because we're using val length, it doesn't matter how many items we have there, how many columns we need, it's going to adjust accordingly. So it's going to adjust dynamically. So let's run that one more time. And also we notice that it's still buggy, because if we're pushing in, our array is changing, and while we're creating and constructing it, our array has changed, because with arrays we're referencing the same memory location. So it's the same idea as regular JavaScript. So that means that we need to clone the array. So let's create a temporary clone array value, and we want to clone the val array, and using map we can return back whatever the values are contained within the array, and this is going to allow us to clone the array. So just as we would with JavaScript, and then within the cloned array, that's where we're going to push the value of start. So that will allow us to distinguish. And typically, if you are using the prepend, you're not going to have to worry about the array and cloning it. You can just use whatever the array value that has been sent. But in this particular example, that we're appending and prepending. So we're doing it all at the same time. So let's go into test. And now we've got the end, and the problem here is that we're not setting the value with the cloned array. So we need to update that and adjust the prepend script with the clone array value. So run it one more time, and this time we should have start and we should have end on each one of the available cells that we've just created and added to. You can run your functions from your Google Apps script as custom functions and directly within the spreadsheet without having to open up the app script. So let me show you an example of it. So let's do a select value, and it's going to return back the A1. So just select value A1. And that's going to be the custom function that we're going to run. And what it will do is it will return back, and taking the spreadsheet app, it'll get whatever the active value is, and then also get the active range. And we know with the range, then we can select that active range, and we want to get the A1 notation value. So we're just going to return back the A1 notation. So now this is a fairly long function, but let's just go to any cell, and you press the equal sign and press the function that you want to run, hit enter, it'll go loading, and then it will return back the results. So this cell is D4, so D and the column D and the row of 4. So the same idea as when you do the custom built-in functions. So in this case we're running sum, and sum requires some parameters here that we need to add in. So it does require some values. So I'm going to add in the 2 values, close off the brackets, and it's going to provide a sum that's one of the built-in functions that are already within the Google Apps script. So there are some things to consider when you are creating the custom functions. So you can create custom functions by any name. That you don't have to have them as uppercase. The only reason that I'm doing it as uppercase is that this is commonly done for the built-in functions. So the capitalization actually doesn't matter, but the names are traditionally uppercase. Also, you need to create a corresponding function within the Google Apps script in order to be able to reference it. Custom functions cannot end with an underscore, so that denotes a private function in Apps script. And also the custom functions need to be distinct names from all the built-in functions. So you can't create one called sum and run that you're going to experience some errors and some issues. So that's how you can create the custom functions within the Google Apps script and run those functions. So you don't always have to go over to the script. You can just simply select the cell and run the function that way. And eventually they will populate within the dropdown. And so that will populate the content with the A1 value, the A1 notation value for the cell. So let's go ahead and add a custom formula to the sheet. So we'll still be using the test sheet. And I'm going to just clear out the existing data that we have. So we want to create a formula that's going to be sitting within the column C that's going to add the first two columns together. And we'll create a function, add formula. So first let's get the sheet object. So SpreadsheetApp get active. And the sheet that we want to use is going to be from the spreadsheet object, sheet by name. And the sheet that we want to use is going to be the test sheet. Next, selecting the range that we want to utilize. So from within the sheet object, get range. And we'll use the A notation range. So the range that we want to use is C1 to C15. And you can just separate it with a colon like that in order to select the range. And then within the range, we have an option to set formula. And we'll set up a formula where if we want to set the formula of sum equals B to 3, we can set that. And it's missing the arguments, that's why we're throwing an error. So let's take sum, and we'll take A1 to B1 and run the add formula. So we were able to add the formula into column C. And now it's made the calculations of adding A and B together with the sum. And of course, you can do more complex formulas of any of the built-in functions that are available. And also, while you do have the range object, you can also set the colors. So we've got options for setting the font color if we want. So that's one that we haven't done before. So let's set it to red. We can also use the range set background. And maybe we want to set the background to pink. And let's run that one more time, so we can see which ones we've set the formula to. So that's how you can create custom functions and also add formulas to your cells within the spreadsheet. So try it out. In this lesson, we're going to be adding the ability to set a comment. We're going to do that with the UI. So whatever the selected cell is, and selecting the cell, and then we're going to use the UI function in order to have a pop-up window prompt asking what type of comment we want to leave for the cell. So creating our first function on open. So whenever we're open, set up the UI object within the spreadsheet app and get the UI. And then within the UI, we're going to create a menu, and we need the caption for the menu. And within the menu itself, let's add some items to the menu. So the first one is going to run the function add comment. And the add comment is going to run a function called adder. We're going to have a prompt, and then within the prompt, that's where we're going to be adding to whatever the cell is. And then lastly, let's add to the UI. So on open, we're going to add that function to the UI. Let's create our adder function. And within the adder function, we're going to have a prompt. So we're going to pick up the UI object as well and use the UI prompt to ask a question comment would you like to add? And we're going to be expecting a response. So let's get a response back from the prompt. And we'll just use the default button values. So we'll check to see if the response selected button object is equal to the UI button OK. And if it is, then we're going to add the comment to whatever the active cell is. So we need to also select whatever the active cell is within the sheet. So let's select from the sheet object and we'll get whatever the active cell is. So using the SpreadsheetApp class, we're going to get the active sheet and then get the active, and then we're also going to get the active range. And then within the logger log, let's output the sheet get value. And we'll try it out just to make sure that it's working. So let's select a sheet and we'll run the adder function and we're going to get the value. So let's run adder. And we're getting the value of 15. What comment would you like to add? And we're not going to see anything within the logger. So now we're ready to select. So we've got the active range. And that means that we can get the active cell as well. So that's just going to return back the one active cell. And because we're placing the comment on the one cell, so we're going to get whatever the active cell is. Can get rid of that test. And now we can take the cell and we can set a comment. And the comment that we're setting is the response text that's coming back from the prompt. Let's run the UI, do the add comment. And now it's added the comment. And you can see that we've got a comment with whatever the value was that we had within the pop-up. And if we have multiple cells connected and we do an add comment, it's going to add it only to the first top cell because instead of getting the full range, we're just getting the active cell. So that's how you can select the cell and add a comment to it. And if we already have a comment that's existing, what's going to happen is that it's going to overwrite whatever the existing comment is. So go ahead, try that out. And that's how you can set comments in your spreadsheet using Google Apps Script. In the previous lessons, we've provided a number of examples of what we can do within the spreadsheet, from adding into the UI to copying and pasting, adding notes, and also just all kinds of really interesting things that you can do with the different pop-ups, the modals, the side menu bars, and interacting with the various ranges and pieces of content that we have available to us within the spreadsheet. And a lot of times you're going to find that spreadsheets are a great place to store data, and then using that data, manipulating that data, and getting that data with Google Apps Script is a very effective way to store and make use of Google Sheets. One of the best ways to learn is to try the code out for yourself and also make combinations of what you've seen within the previous lessons. There's also really good resources within the editor itself. Whenever you hover over any of the functions, it'll give you more details to what that function is, the different parameters that are required, and what it does. And then it also does have some code examples of how you can use that method and use it within your own Google Apps Script. Another great way is just to select different objects. So in this case, we've selected whatever the active cell is, and when we press the dot, we get a drop down of all the different available methods for that particular object. So we can get the width, we can get the values, we'll get a lot of different information that's contained in here. We saw that set background. We can also set borders, set the font colors. So there are a lot of options for different methods, and you can see all of them when you do select the object and you do the dot, and you see the drop down of all these different available methods that are available for that particular object. And as well, whenever you're making a selection of that, so create a function, call it test, and then within the test function, you make a selection of the spreadsheet object, and then from there, you're going to get different options as to what is available for this. So we can open by ID, open by URL. So those are some of the more commonly used ones. We can set the active range, so just as we can get it. So pretty much anything that you can get, you can also set as well. And then once you've got the active value, so this is referencing the active spreadsheet, there's going to be different options as well for getting the sheet itself that's contained within the spreadsheet object, and get the sheet by name. So that's selecting the sheet object. And once you select the sheet object, within the drop down of all the different methods, you've got another opportunity to select that object and apply some of the methods to it. So go ahead and create your own functionality within the Google Spreadsheets. Try out different methods and get more familiar with what can be done within the Spreadsheet app class.